Hello everyone, it's John Patrick, a retired professor. Now spend my life arguing with people about the nature of truth and Christian living. I am a Christian. My presuppositions, my starting point for arguments are Christian. So if you can tolerate that, welcome. We could get to know one another. I want to start with a prayer. Almighty God, give me a deep curiosity about all your creation. Move me to search and question. Give me insight and understanding, a retentive memory and the patience to ponder and reflect. May I not stop short with knowledge, but proceed to the understanding of the heart, wisdom to view the world with the eyes of faith, point out the beginning, direct the progress, help the completion. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. That's Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. The greatest intellect in 500 years, and yet, sadly, to a considerable degree unknown today. But think how empty that would be if the first line was missing, Almighty God, and you just woke up in the morning and said, oh, I need those things in the list, which you do. Whatever job you do, you'll do them better if you have those things. But for the secularist and the reductionist, the person who can't tell the difference between scientism and science, the first line is meaningless. So their life is too. The good news, I think, is that a lot of serious people, there are 3 in my inbox today who were of the reductionistic scientistic persuasion and have moved or are moving or... So the world is changing. Who could think otherwise over what's happened in the last couple of weeks? And we missed a couple of weeks of recording, so what a time to choose a gap. There's been lots. The world in general, Charlie Kirk and the incredible happenings in Britain, they're astonishing. Personally, we've also a time of great... change, another wedding of our grandchildren, another great-grandchild on the way, bringing them up to 7. Christian weddings are so wonderful. They're meaningful in a way. You're not, we promise one another stuff. No. We make these promises asking God to help us and to empower us to do them. Getting up in the morning when you're my age is not the easiest first move. One begins to realize how incredibly dependent we really are. The parable of the vine. With me, you can do anything. Without me, you can do nothing. For most of our lives, we don't think about our incapacities. And we take the capacities which we've been given as a gift for granted without thinking. However, one in particular of the people who's clearly moving is Stephen Pinker, and he was asked to talk, I think, to Parliament in England. He in Canada. He was at Montreal in the past. He may well be a Canadian, but he's been at Harvard for a long while. But he had a lovely little memorable phrase. He said, "University used to be a place where we dressed the same and thought differently. Now university is a place where we dress differently and are forced to think the same." That, of course, is the death of the university, but it's a lovely way to express it in a memorable, very short term. We used to dress the same. There were dress codes that nobody told us about. And as university students, there were some minor differences. But we all went to school and wore a uniform. And our headmaster would tell us frequently that he was very concerned that our behaviour when wearing that uniform should not bring any disrepute on the school. There was an insistence on being properly and tidily dressed. But then within the classes, they wanted to know what we were actually thinking, and there would be nothing that you couldn't say. but you had to be able to stand up and defend it. And when you were beaten, you had to acknowledge it. Now, dress is so outlandish. Basically, people trying to make a statement by the way they dress. The obsession with clothing. How far from the Sermon on the Mount? Why do you worry about what you will put on? Look at the lily of the field, which God makes. Never, even Solomon didn't have clothing like that, and it lasts a day. If God clothes the lily, can you trust him to clothe you? And maybe because he hasn't given us clothing like that of the lily, he's telling us something about what our priorities should be. That, of course, brings me very easily to Charlie Kirk. I came across Charlie Kirk a few years ago and have watched him intermittently becoming more and more impressed with him. His martyrdom, which is what it was, I think that's a perfectly reasonable word to use, because he was killed for what he believes and what he says. And the belief and the saying are so tightly linked that is what is upsetting to the extreme left. The left has very standard ideas that are sort of popcorn utopia, which don't work. And of course, people like Lenin and the early Marxists in Russia understood that they had a major problem, and they never solved it. But Lenin at least clearly understood it. He said, when we have got rid of God, it will be necessary to legalize terror. In America, you used to be proud of the fact that you are a nation of laws. Now, it's questionable whether you can defend that position. Certainly there are many people who don't think that way, and identity politics certainly undermines it. If you're going to build your politics on identity groups, that's not going to produce unity. And when people, which they say, my truth and your truth, you cannot understand me because I am black, as one woman said in court last week. That is crazy. That means you can't have, at the same time, that kind of behavior and then talk about inclusion and multiculturalism. That's why multiculturalism is a lie, because it cannot build a society. Societies can only be built out of what you share. And if you don't share very much, you can't build very much. And what you do share is at a level so deep that most of the time you shouldn't even have to think about it. That was why there were no ethics classes in medical school until the 1980s. And they don't work because they're premised on a false premise or false diagnosis. I remember when our dean in the University of Ottawa Medical School, a very nice man at the time, I don't even know if he's still alive, but I always had respect for him. He was a classic liberal. And I remember talking to him at a cocktail party, one of those get-together things in the Faculty of Medicine. And he had just announced that he was going to start an ethics course for the students. And I was totally skeptical of the whole idea. Yeah, we were talking, and I said to him, what do you expect to achieve with your ethics course? And of course, what he hoped to achieve was better ethics. I said, I don't think it will have that effect. What you're likely to do is to produce students who know some more of what is called ethics, and will set about circumventing it in one way or another. It's not the way that you get an ethical society. I'm probably, I said to him, the only member of your faculty who has one very long lunch every week with a philosopher and sometimes a few others. So I know a little bit about the man from the philosophy department that you have chosen to head up this course. He actually says, I only teach ethics, I don't practice them. A few years later, he left the university in a hurry when one of his graduate students complained about his attempts to seduce his students. He left the university in a hurry. Nevertheless, a few years later, he came back on a committee that was looking at whether our ethics course was acceptable. That's the failure of a society that thinks that policies change culture. They don't, unless the culture has already changed and is ready for them. Those things don't transfer. Charlie Kirk was well aware of that. So what really upset the audiences was the way he came back time and time again to the gospel and said, the bottom line is that if you don't have Christ in your life as Redeemer and Saviour, none of what we're talking about makes a great deal of sense to you, and many of the things you want cannot logically be derived from what you say you believe. And he could show them that time and time again, that they were being conned into believing things which were not true. And for that, he paid the ultimate price, because when you attack somebody's fundamental beliefs, even if you do it in a polite and loving fashion, he could be abrasive, but he was never rude, and he always invited the student to speak, and he did it well. But they never won, and he wasn't at all modest about saying, look, I've never been to university, that's why I've read so many books and talked to so many people who are worth talking to, and got a much better education than you can get in your university. That would be called arrogant or whatever. But it wasn't arrogant, it was descriptive. That is what he had done and what he could honestly say had happened. How many parents out there are looking at their children at the moment with worry? Suicide rates are going up, anxiety rates are going up, and they don't remember anything in the long term. When you ask them, what has changed in your way of understanding the world? They hardly understand the question. And when I say to them, have you ever finished a day in your university and come home and said, my goodness, I'm wiser now than I was this morning? They laugh. It's unthinkable. Because the university is a memorize and dump system. Now, having added to it a thought police component, where a limited set of ideas have to be forced into a dominant position everywhere. And it's utter rubbish. And the only way you can deal with people who can see that it's utter rubbish and say it is by cancelling them, and lots of cancelling has gone on. I think one of the first people who got cancelled many years ago is much beloved and now departed Roger Scruton, who, as a young professor, got cancelled before the word existed. And he realised his career within the British university system was over. So he went behind the Iron Curtain and taught in the underground church in Czechoslovakia, as it was then. He's almost a saint in the Czech Republic, because what he did was teach the core understandings of what it means to live a good life, from the Greeks through Judeo-Christian thought to the present. He read the Muslims too, and he read the moderns and was scathing in his deconstruction of them. The book that he does that best in, Frauds, and it's an alliteration of F's, but it's not an easy book to read. But he takes the cultural leaders as they think of themselves and deconstructs them. I am the way, the truth, and the life, says Jesus. And he didn't write a single word, but his words are more memorably imprinted on millions, billions of lives. And that changed the world. The only thing that we know that he wrote was in the sand, so we don't even know what he wrote. But we know what he said. And it's powerful. Thomas Aquinas spent his life trying to take what he had learned about Christ and apply it to the world. And I would argue that Aquinas, building on Augustine, who was very much a foundational writer for him, made the modern world possible. But that's probably a whole different talk. I go down rabbit holes, as you know, and that one is tempting me at the moment, but I'll try and resist the temptation, I think. Do read Chesterton's book on St. Thomas Aquinas. I think it has the subtitle, The Dumb Ox, because you would think about everything, so he got that title. But of course, Chesterton wrote his biography brilliantly. All the great Aquinas, I shouldn't say all, many of the great Aquinas scholars have said, we can't touch Chesterton in terms of how he distilled the essence of this man. Maritain said, and the other French philosophers, they really were in awe of what Chesterton did in a very short period. So if you want a brief biography to read this summer, Chesterton's Aquinas would be a very good example. So what Thomas Aquinas wanted to do was to give us a foundational understanding that could use what the Greeks and others had achieved and show us how Christianity had no problems with truth in any place where it may find it. But it dealt with things in a way that went deeper than Aristotle. Aristotle's science was not science. He had a great mind, he knew it, and so he thought about things and then said how they were. So things obviously fell in proportion to their weight, except that they didn't, and he didn't even go to the nearest cliff to find out whether that was true or not. And that reverence for Aristotle pervaded the Christian community, the Catholic Church. There was no Protestant church. Always remember, Protestants, that God trusted the Catholics with the church for the first 1,500 years. Well, they didn't get going immediately, but 1,000 years anyway. But famously, they had got to the point by the time of Galileo where one of their physicists said to Galileo, nothing that you see through that telescope can change the words and truth of Aristotle. That meant science couldn't proceed forward by saying, we have discovered something that appears to be true, we have to take account of it. Fortunately, that particular physicist and his breed died out, and what was happening proceeded forward. And of course, the key event, I will go at least that far down this road, was the banning of the teaching of Aquinas by the Bishop of Paris, which forced his teachers, since they couldn't teach deductive logic, they stumbled on the idea that inductive logic might be better. But you see, inductive logic is not safe. It's unbelievable, in fact, if you don't have Christian theology underpinning it. That's what I had to learn when I went to Africa, that yes, using an experimental approach to treating severely malnourished children in the TMIU in Jamaica led over a period of approximately 25 years to taking a mortality rate of 50% down to zero. We'd learned what to do, and amazingly, or not amazingly, depending on your background, the proper way to treat those children is so counterintuitive that a mother dumped down in a famine would actually increase the death rate in the first few weeks. but experimental step-by-step inductive reasoning that got us to the solution. But when I went to Africa, the solution couldn't be enculturated. It couldn't be built into the culture. They had no means of processing it. So when I was bullied into going there and setting up a program and get my children to do it, they could do it, but the Africans couldn't, because the intellectual foundations that we took for granted did not exist. Everywhere you go in the world, people must presume some things to be true, some way of living. And it's not about physical facts. It's about metaphysics. It's about how you get to your oughts and shoulds and musts, and how you construct a view of the world that enables you to build something. Now, obviously, what I encountered shook me quite severely, because I realized after a year or so that the problem I faced was not technical, because I was in a pagan culture. I'm not using that in a pejorative sense. That's purely descriptive. By pagan, I mean no sense of a God over all that made a difference in their lives, but they explained their world by reference to evil spirits. Now, there's nothing stupid about that. If you live in an environment where half your children die before maturity, your crops fail apparently at random, disease strikes at random, and you have the worst governments in the world, there's not much evidence of a God of love, is there? But without the belief that God's character must show in his creation, and therefore it will be ordered, you would never do an experiment. Now, that there is a slow, very slow move in that direction of recognizing what successful experiments imply theologically. So, people doing molecular biology at the top levels will not want to argue about whether there's a God or not. We can do molecular biology without acknowledging God. The smarter ones recognize that the experimental approach that we have used to get here couldn't be thought of without the idea that there is order under the surface chaos of life. And, of course, the sheer complexity of molecular biology, quantum physics, cosmology is mind-boggling. It's overwhelming. And it couldn't happen by chance. So the only thing they can do is not have that discussion at the moment. They know they can't win it anymore. It'll take 15 or 20 years for physics and biology in high school to come to terms with this reality. It's over at the top levels of academia. There are still some people hanging in there trying to defend it, but it's over. Stunning. I mean, when you just have to think that in the center of every cell in your body, there's a meter of coding which gives the basic structure of your life. DNA doesn't make anything. It's a library blueprints, but my goodness, it's astonishing. And what's even more stunning, and you can't even come up with I can't come up with a proper analogy, but it's overwritten. In other words, in the same sequence of letters, there's more than one message, depending on where you start. And they're both functional. That is mind-bogglingly impossible to imagine by chance. So, we have good news in the background that the tacit world in some bits of science is actually getting richer again. But the tacit world of our children, what they believe to be true without thinking, and that's almost everything, is things like you can choose your own gender. Really? No, you can choose to dress in drag and be infertile if you want. Nobody can make you into a fertile woman if you're a man, or a fertile man if you're a woman. Cannot be done. We manipulate things with in vitro fertilization, but you didn't do that. It's not your genes. And yet they can be passionate about this. And because they feel it, it has to be true. In the university, I have to deal all the while with the social justice warriors who are proposing something that's entirely based on what they believe ought to happen with no history of the world. Back to Lenin, where I departed a little while ago. Why did he say when we got rid of God it will be necessary to legalize terror? Because what God had given to Western Europe in particular had produced law-driven society. But without that belief in transcendence, you can't actually derive a legal system. The huge attempt that's produced multiple theses. I've got name block for the guy who wrote the book on justice now, which is bizarre. It'll come back the moment I stop speaking on this video, but you can find him anyway. But his system of justice is artificial, and it doesn't work. That's why MacIntyre, who died recently, his most important book was After Virtue, and he understood that virtue was what we needed, and we couldn't get it from the world that we pretend is adequate to explain everything. So the end of his great book was, we are waiting for a doubtless new St. Benedict. Why? A St. Benedict? Yeah. You need what St. Benedict believed in order to run monasteries, which preserved what learning there was and set up people like Aquinas, which gave us the step into the modern world. The young people are so uneducated because they've been propagandized. I mean, the growth of economies is a very, very recent phenomenon. Banking is a very recent phenomenon in the way that it works now. It's dependent upon trust, so it's very fragile. It could collapse for that reason. I tell students all the while, the most important thing you have to do is to find a network of people you can really trust. Evidence-based medicine is rubbish. Because if you can't read the methods section of the papers you're looking up, give me the original data and I'll look at it. Sure, yeah. Now we're acknowledging Jay Bhattacharya's that he's going to set about trying to get built into research again, verification research done by independent researchers, because virtually nothing in the scientific literature can be trusted unless you can read the methodology, know that it's used properly, and can find a paper confirming what has been shown. You can't sit in a political forum and pontificate saying the data shows the science is in. The science is never in. It's always provisional. Its justification is that it works. So that doesn't mean it's true. It means it's given us a lever on truth which allows us to move forward. Newton didn't even pretend. He said, I don't know what gravity is. I've just given you a model that works. It enables us to understand how the heavens work in a way that we couldn't before. And if it leads people to God, I will be very happy. Second edition. So the world that we're looking at the moment, it doesn't seem to me yet that it realizes what is at stake. Charlie Kirk knew that what he was saying was true. It had changed his life. It had changed other people's lives. But we're very good at dumbing down what we say we believe so that we are in control. That's always the problem. And the church got to the point where it put chains on Bibles because it wanted to maintain its hold on interpretation. That's what experts do all the while. I mean, medicine is like that. When I arrived in Canada, from England via Jamaica. The rules were such that if I wanted to be a clinical consultant, I had to do my residency again. Well, I wasn't going to do that. So I only saw a few patients a week, but I could only bill as though I was a family practitioner, although I was a fifth level referral. That's just job protection. I mean, how could Canada possibly argue that their medical training system is better than the one I'd gone through? They had won Nobel Prize in medicine. England had dozens. No, but it's totally understandable. And everywhere, people who've got a niche that enables them, because of the letters after their name, to charge for their signature, they do it. But trust is another matter, isn't it? Banking is dependent upon trust. And yet the people who set up the first stock exchange were not the most honest people in the world, many of them. The Dutch did it. They were probably the only ones with enough tacit knowledge of how you ought to behave for it to work to a degree. But we all know about Ponzi schemes and all the other things that go on. Somehow we cobble the bits together and pick up the bits and have another try. But people's lives are being damaged in the process. I mean, Tom Sowell's wonderful work pointing out that the big problem to the black community in the Western world is that they have been persuaded that claiming victim status is the way to go. Well, it isn't. The way to go is to see something you can do and doing it regardless of whether people are trying to stop you or not. Look at the explosion of invention in Britain that led to the start of the Industrial Revolution was very dependent on people without any education but lots of guts. The best leaders in the black community recognize the problem is that every boy needs a father to kick him in the pants every now and again, but to also give him a model that is based on, okay, what do you have to do, what do you need to do, and quit moaning about how you feel. When I was growing up in the working class, if you wanted sympathy, you went to your mother, because you knew if you went to your dad, he'd say, suck it up, lad, that's just what life is like. Different roles. And the attempt to pretend that you can decide how many people should be in any given area by something as unreliable as race or gender. No, it's got to be competence at the end of the day. You don't want to know that your pilot was chosen by affirmative action, do you? Nor your surgeon, nor your physician, nor anyone else that does anything important. So we've got to get back to that. Charlie Kirk was attacking the stupidity of what was being taught to the students, and that they weren't given enough time to think their way through it and recognize how crazy it was. And he could make them do that. When you ask students, what have you actually learned? What can you do? What can you quote? Do you know why? Has it been discussed by other people? That doesn't happen. They can't retake an exam they took 6 weeks ago and pass it because they're not persuaded to learn things, only to memorize. So their short-term memories get them through, but that won't produce a long-term society. What does is tacit knowledge, which comes from being apprenticed or comes from religion. The things you think you know will be significantly different depending on whether you're a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Christian, a Marxist, a nihilist. They all have different starting points. And the only way you can sort out the difference is which one gives you the best hold on meaning? Which one gives you the best set of purposes? Which one deals with the reality that when you examine your own soul, it's a mess? I challenge any one of you listening to this at the moment who doesn't actually have a faith to do a very simple exercise. Sit down and write down all the worst thoughts and worst actions you have ever had or performed. You're not one of you is going to say there's no such category in my life, because there is. And you've all been hurt by people who had power over you, whose behavior was bad in the same sort of way. It's not an accident that Christ begins his ministry by saying, you must face the truth about your own soul. That's what poverty of spirit means, looking inside yourself and facing the horror. And then he says something extraordinary. The kingdom is yours. Obviously, not in any real sense at that moment, but what he's saying, I think, is because you have now become, for the first time in your life, truthful about your problem, you will get to me, because I am the only solution to that problem. Charlie Kirk was unafraid to say that every week, everywhere he went. So he was attacking their sacred cows, and that's dangerous. It can get you killed, as it did in his case. So pray for his wife and his children as they go through this terribly hard patch, which will last for their whole lives in one sense or another. But I didn't spend a large chunk of my life caring for children that modern liberal wants to kill before they're born, not to realize that if I wanted to make the world a worse place, I would take all suffering out of it, especially the suffering of children. They civilize us, they humble us, they have an important role, and amazingly they sometimes can almost explicitly say that to you. To watch a child comfort its parents because it is dying is mind-bogglingly soul-shattering. But they do it. They do it. The death of children, the death of parents. I mean, our reductive world thinks that when somebody says, I want to die, you should offer them maid and we will kill you comfortably. What they're actually asking is, it's a lament. We don't know how to recognize a lament anymore. They're saying, tell me that my life matters. What they're saying is, I feel useless. They're not useless. What you have to tell them is, we love you. Remember the things that were done and said and the laughter they caused. We've had a lot of this over the last few days. I mean, we've had, how many of it? 4 of our great-grandchildren in the house with 3 couples, 3 of my grandchildren and their spouses. A bit tiring for people of our age, but wonderfully tiring. And laughter as you think of things that happened in the past, moments of truth that sometimes they don't remember, but their children are delighted to hear of the moments when we all did stupid things which we've done, and to laugh over them. I hope and pray that you will recognize that what I'm talking about is not trivial. I want to finish by reading John Donne, one of my favorite poets. I do really like things said well, and I try to remember them so that I can say them and acknowledge who wrote them or who said them. This poem, I should warn you, comes with a warning, because John Donne uses a metaphor at the end of this poem which would be not acceptable in many churches. But listen to it. Batter my heart, 3-person God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like a usurped town, to another Jew, labour to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captive and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break the knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you ravish me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste except you ravish me. A pretty vigorous metaphor at the end, but a beautiful poem. We do want to know God in that kind of way.